The spring sun shone brightly over the busy streets of Memphis that Thursday afternoon. School had just let out, and 16-year-old Nia Johnson stood at the bus stop, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She bobbed her head slightly to the music playing through her earbuds, occasionally glancing up the street for any sign of the number 47 bus that would take her home. Nia had aced her history test today. She couldn't wait to tell her grandmother, who had helped her study all weekend. Her fingers scrolled through her phone as she sent a quick text. Got an A on the test. Bus running late. Be home soon. She didn't notice the police cruiser that pulled up to the curb until its shadow fell across her. Only when the car door opened with a distinct creak did Nia look up, pulling one earbud out. Officer Richard Winters stepped out of the vehicle. He was a tall man with a square jaw and hard eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. 12 years on the force had left him with a permanent furrow between his brows. He approached Nia with a hand resting casually on his belt, close to his holster. "What are you doing here?" Officer Winters asked, his voice carrying that official tone that made Nia stand up straighter. "Waiting for the bus, sir," she answered politely, the way her grandmother had always taught her to speak to police officers. "The number 47. Officer Winters looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her colorful sneakers and the pins decorating her backpack. "Been standing here long. We've had complaints about loitering in this area." Nia glanced around, confused. The bus stop was public property, and at least 3 other people were waiting nearby. None of them were being questioned. "About 15 minutes, sir. The bus should be here soon." "Let me see some ID," Officer Winters demanded, taking a step closer. Nia's heart began to beat faster. She knew her rights. She'd paid attention in civics class. "May I ask why you need my ID?" "I'm just waiting for the bus." Something changed in Officer Winters' face then, like a cloud passing over the sun. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. "When an officer asks for identification, you provide it. That's how this works." His voice had dropped lower, harder. People were starting to notice now. A woman with grocery bags slowed her pace. A man in a business suit frowned as he passed by. 2 high school boys from near school stopped completely, watching from a few yards away. "I understand, sir," Nia said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I believe I have the right to know why I'm being asked for ID when I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Winters moved with unexpected speed. He grabbed Nia's arm and pulled her away from the bench, causing her to drop her phone. It clattered to the sidewalk. "Stand against that wall," he ordered, pointing to the bus shelter. "Now." Nia felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Always stay calm, never give them a reason. She moved to the wall as instructed. "Empty your backpack," Officer Winters commanded, his voice rising. "Turn it inside out." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Someone whispered, "This isn't right." Another person had their phone out, recording. "Why are you doing this?" Nia asked, her voice finally breaking as she unzipped her backpack with shaking hands. "Because I said so," Officer Winters snapped, using words that made several onlookers gasp. He used terms no officer should use, especially to a teenage girl, words tinged with prejudice that made it clear why Nia had been singled out. As Nia dumped the contents of her backpack onto the sidewalk, textbooks, notebooks, pencil case, her history test with the bright red A circled at the top, she felt a hot tear slide down her cheek. Her schoolwork scattered across the dirty pavement, and her dignity went with it. But what Officer Winters didn't realize as he continued his tirade was that justice was already in motion. Behind him, phones were recording, witnesses were calling 911, and his career was about to unravel in a matter of minutes. The crowd around the bus stop grew larger as Officer Winters continued his verbal assault on Nia. Her school supplies lay scattered across the dirty sidewalk, her carefully organized notes now blown by the spring breeze, her history textbook splayed open face down, and her prized calculator that her grandmother had saved up to buy her now had a crack running across its screen. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Officer Winters barked, his face flushed with anger. The veins in his neck bulged as he leaned in closer to Nia, who was trying desperately to maintain her composure. "Yes, sir," she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. She raised her eyes to meet his, fighting back tears. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down completely. An older woman with silver-streaked hair stepped forward from the gathering crowd. "That's enough. She's just a child waiting for the bus. What's wrong with you?" Officer Winters spun around, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "Step back, ma'am. This is police business. You're interfering with an investigation." "Investigation of what?" called out a man in work clothes, his lunch cooler still in hand. "Waiting for public transportation while being black. We all see what's happening here." By now, at least 7 people had their phones out, recording the incident. The small red recording lights were like fireflies in the growing crowd, documenting every second of the officer's behavior. "All of you, back up now." Officer Winters shouted, his authority clearly slipping away as more witnesses gathered. "This is a police matter." Nia's hands trembled as she knelt to gather her belongings, textbooks and papers now smudged with dirt and footprints. As she reached for her history test with the bright red R, the one she'd been so proud of just minutes ago, Officer Winters kicked it further away. "Did I say you could pick that up?" he snapped. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Someone in the back shouted, "I've got all this on video." The older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled out her phone and deliberately held it up. "I'm calling 911 right now, not on this child, but on you, officer. Your badge number is 8741. I can read it clear as day, and so can everyone else here." Officer Winters seemed to suddenly realize the situation he had created. His eyes darted around at the crowd, at the many phones recording his every move and word. But instead of backing down, his anger only intensified. "Stand up," he ordered Nia, who was still trying to salvage her school materials. When she didn't move quickly enough, he reached down and roughly pulled her up by her arm. "Ow, you're hurting me," Nia cried out, no longer able to hold back her tears. That was the breaking point for the crowd. The man with the lunch cooler stepped forward. "Take your hands off her. She's not resisting anything." "She's disobeying a direct order," Officer Winters shouted back, still gripping Nia's arm. "I can arrest every single one of you for obstruction." Just then, the distinctive sound of another police siren cut through the tension. A second patrol car pulled up to the curb, lights flashing. Officer Winters' expression changed from anger to confusion as he recognized the vehicle. Lieutenant Grace Chen stepped out, taking in the scene before her with a quick, professional glance. The tearful teenager, the scattered school supplies, the angry officer, and the crowd of citizens with recording phones. "Officer Winters," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "Release the girl immediately and step away." "Lieutenant, I was just—" "Now, Officer Winters," Lieutenant Chen repeated, her hand raised to cut him off. "I've already seen the live stream. It's all over social media already." For the first time, real fear flashed across Officer Winters' face as he realized what was happening. The humiliation he had inflicted was about to come full circle, and the consequences would be swift and severe. As Lieutenant Chen approached, she addressed Nia with a gentle voice that contrasted sharply with Officer Winters' harsh tone. "Are you all right, miss? Help is here now." The air seemed to crackle with tension as Lieutenant Chen positioned herself between Nia and Officer Winters. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people now, a mix of bus riders, shopkeepers from nearby stores, and passers-by who had stopped when they noticed the commotion. "Everyone please stay calm," Lieutenant Chen announced, her voice steady and professional. "I need some space here." A postal worker named Thomas paused his delivery route, setting down his mailbag. He'd been recording the entire incident since he first spotted Officer Winters forcing Nia against the wall. Thomas stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am, I've got the whole thing on video, starting from when he first approached her," Thomas said, holding up his phone. "Been recording for almost 8 minutes now. The girl didn't do anything wrong." Lieutenant Chen nodded. "Thank you, sir. I'll need a statement from you and a copy of that video." Officer Winters' face had turned a deep shade of red. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, I was conducting a legitimate stop. This girl was—" "Officer Winters, I'm not discussing this right now," Lieutenant Chen cut him off sharply. She turned to Nia, whose cheeks were still wet with tears. "Sweetheart, are you hurt anywhere?" Nia rubbed her arm where Officer Winters had grabbed her. My arm hurts a little, but I think I'm okay. Her voice trembled slightly. The older woman with silver hair who had called 911 stepped forward. I'm Doris Wilson. I live just up the street. I saw this officer verbally assault this child and use language no police officer should ever use. I won't repeat what he said, but it was clearly racial. Other voices joined in. He made her dump her backpack for no reason. He kicked her school papers while she was trying to pick them up. I heard him from inside my shop and came out to see what was happening, added a man in a baker's apron, pointing to the bakery across the street. Lieutenant Chen listened carefully, her expression growing more serious by the moment. She helped Nia gather her scattered belongings, picking up the history test with the red A at the top. You did great on your test, she said softly to Nia, handing her the paper. Thank you, Nia whispered, carefully placing it in her backpack along with her other recovered items. Officer Winters shifted impatiently. Lieutenant, are we really doing this? Taking the word of a bunch of random people over a police officer? Random people? Thomas the postal worker challenged. I've been delivering mail on this route for 11 years. I know most folks around here by name. Lieutenant Chen raised her hand for silence as her radio crackled. She spoke briefly into it, confirming her location and requesting additional support. When she turned back to face Officer Winters, her expression had hardened. Officer Winters, I've received confirmation that multiple videos of this incident are already circulating online. The chief has seen the footage. She paused, letting the significance of her words sink in. He's instructed me to take immediate action. The crowd grew quiet, sensing something unprecedented was about to happen. Richard Winters, Lieutenant Chen said formally, I am relieving you of duty effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and weapon. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Officer Winters' face drained of color. You can't be serious, he stammered. Over this? She was disrespectful and... That's enough. Lieutenant Chen's voice cut through the air like a knife. Your body camera appears to be off, which is a direct violation of department policy. Based on the evidence I've already seen and the eyewitness accounts here, you're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. She gestured to her patrol car. Now, please turn around. When Officer Winters didn't move, she added more firmly, don't make this worse for yourself. Slowly, with visible reluctance, Officer Winters turned around. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Lieutenant Chen removed his service weapon and handcuffed him, the same handcuffs he had threatened to use on Nia just minutes earlier. As Lieutenant Chen guided Officer Winters toward her patrol car, Nia stood with her backpack clutched to her chest, barely able to process the dramatic turn of events. The bus she had been waiting for finally pulled up to the stop, but Nia made no move to board it. This moment felt too important to leave. The crowd murmured in disbelief as they watched Officer Winters being placed in the back of Lieutenant Chen's patrol car. Many still had their phones out, recording this unexpected turn of events. No one made a move to leave. This was something none of them had ever witnessed before, an officer being arrested at the scene of his own misconduct. Lieutenant Chen closed the car door firmly and turned back to address the gathering. I need statements from as many witnesses as possible. Another unit will be here shortly to help collect your information. She approached Nia, who stood clutching her backpack, still trying to process everything that had just happened. You should call your parents or guardians, Lieutenant Chen said gently. I'd like them to be here for this. Nia nodded and pulled out her phone with trembling hands. My grandmother. She's the one who takes care of me. She dialed, and after a brief conversation filled with reassurances that she was physically okay, she hung up. She's coming. She'll be here in about 15 minutes. A second police car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Unlike Officer Winters, they approached the scene with care and respect, immediately taking direction from Lieutenant Chen. Officer Rodriguez, please begin taking witness statements, Lieutenant Chen instructed. Officer Powell, secure the scene and check if any of the surrounding businesses have security cameras that might have captured additional footage. As the officers set to work, Thomas the postal worker approached Lieutenant Chen. Ma'am, I need to finish my route, but I want to make sure you have my video before I go. Thank you, Lieutenant Chen replied, pulling out a department-issued tablet. If you could transfer it here and leave your contact information with Officer Rodriguez, we'll make sure you're not held up too long." While Thomas was transferring the video, Doris Wilson sat down next to Nia on the bus stop bench. "Are you sure you're all right, dear?" she asked, her eyes full of grandmotherly concern. "I think so," Nia replied, still looking a bit shaken. "I just don't understand why he picked me out like that. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Doris patted her hand gently. "Of course you weren't. Some people carry darkness in their hearts, and they put that darkness on others who don't deserve it. But look around you." She gestured to the crowd of witnesses who were now lining up to give their statements. "There are more good people in this world than bad ones." Lieutenant Chen watched this exchange with approval before walking back to her patrol car. She leaned in through the open front window and spoke quietly into her radio, her expression serious as she reported to her superiors. Inside the police car, Officer Winters sat in stunned silence, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Through the window, he could see people pointing at him, some shaking their heads in disgust. His career was unraveling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do about it. A small blue sedan pulled up, and an elderly woman emerged, moving with surprising speed despite her age. "Nia," she called out, rushing toward her granddaughter. Nia jumped up from the bench and ran into her grandmother's arms. "Grandma." Mrs. Johnson held her granddaughter tight, checking her over for any injuries. "Are you hurt? What happened?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes flashed with a combination of concern and anger. Lieutenant Chen approached them. "Mrs. Johnson? I'm Lieutenant Chen. I'd like to explain what happened and what happens next." As Lieutenant Chen briefed Mrs. Johnson, a news van pulled up at the edge of the scene. A reporter and cameraman quickly set up, preparing to broadcast live. "Looks like this is going to make the evening news," Doris commented to Thomas, who was just finishing giving his statement. "Good," Thomas replied firmly. "People need to see this, not just what that officer did, but what happened afterward. They need to see that sometimes justice can be swift." In the patrol car, Officer Winters watched the news crew setting up, the full weight of his actions beginning to crush him. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, messages from fellow officers who had already seen the videos online, from supervisors demanding explanations, from a union representative offering legal counsel. But there was no explaining away what dozens of witnesses had seen and recorded. For perhaps the first time in his career, Officer Richard Winters was facing immediate consequences for his actions. By evening, the video of Officer Winters humiliating Nia had spread across every social media platform. People shared it with angry comments, calling for justice and change. The follow-up videos showing Lieutenant Chen putting Officer Winters in handcuffs spread just as quickly, bringing surprise and hope to many who had grown used to seeing such incidents go unpunished. Nia sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, a mug of hot chocolate warming her hands. The house phone had been ringing non-stop, with calls from concerned family members, friends, and even a few local community leaders. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to," Mrs. Johnson told her granddaughter firmly as she silenced the ringing phone once again. "Your well-being comes first." Nia nodded, staring into her mug. "I keep thinking about how quickly it all happened. One minute I was just waiting for the bus, and the next." Her voice trailed off. Her grandmother sat down beside her and took her hand. "I know, baby, but you did everything right. You were respectful but stood your ground. I'm so proud of you." Across town at the police headquarters, the situation was unfolding at an unprecedented pace. Police Chief Rivera had called an emergency meeting with the department's top brass and representatives from the city's legal department. The mood in the conference room was tense. "The videos are clear as day," Chief Rivera said, closing the laptop after they had all watched the footage for the third time. Officer Winters violated at least 7 department policies and potentially broke several laws in the process. "The mayor's office is getting flooded with calls," added City Attorney Patel. "This isn't something we can investigate slowly over months. The public wants immediate action." Lieutenant Chen, who had been invited to the meeting after handling the scene, spoke up. "Sir, when I arrived at the scene, multiple witnesses reported hearing Officer Winters use racial slurs. His body camera was deliberately turned off, which is a direct violation of our most recent policy updates." Chief Rivera nodded grimly. That alone is grounds for termination. But this goes beyond firing him. We're looking at criminal charges. His personnel file shows 3 previous complaints for excessive force, added Captain Washington, sliding a folder across the table. All filed by black citizens. All dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The room fell silent as this information sank in. Not this time, Chief Rivera said finally. We have the evidence. We have the witnesses. There will be no sweeping this under the rug. Meanwhile, at the county jail, Officer Winters sat in a holding cell, still in uniform but stripped of his badge, gun, and belt. He had been processed like any other suspect, fingerprinted, photographed, and read his rights. His union representative, a veteran officer named Detective Holt, stood outside the cell, looking troubled. Richard, I'm going to be straight with you. I've seen the videos, all of them. The union can provide you with legal counsel, but he hesitated. You need to prepare yourself. This isn't going away. Officer Winters looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. Over some teenage girl with an attitude. This is ridiculous. Cops deal with disrespect every day. Since when is that a crime? Detective Holt shook his head slowly. That's not what I saw in those videos, Richard, and it's not what dozens of witnesses saw either. What you did crossed every line we have. He paused. The department is moving to formally charge you tomorrow morning. The DA is talking about civil rights violations, among other things. For the first time, genuine fear showed in Officer Winters' eyes. Civil rights violations? That's federal. You can't be serious. The FBI has already requested the case files, Detective Holt confirmed. Like I said, this isn't going away. Back at Nia's home, her grandmother's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and turned to Nia. That was Pastor Lloyd. He's organizing a community support meeting tomorrow at the church. A lot of people want to show you that what happened today isn't what our community stands for. Her grandmother's eyes were gentle but determined. You don't have to go if you don't feel up to it. Nia was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened her shoulders slightly. I think I want to go, she said softly. I want to thank the people who stood up for me today, especially Thomas and Doris. Her grandmother smiled and hugged her. You know, sometimes terrible things lead to important changes. What happened to you today was wrong in every way. But the way it's being handled? That gives me hope. The community center was packed to capacity the following evening. People from all walks of life had come to show their support for Nia. Neighbors, classmates, teachers, and many who had only learned about the incident through the news or social media. The atmosphere buzzed with a mixture of outrage and solidarity. Nia and her grandmother arrived a few minutes after the meeting had started. They slipped in quietly, hoping not to draw attention, but a hush fell over the room as people recognized them. Then, spontaneously, people began to applaud. Pastor Lloyd, a tall man with kind eyes and graying hair, approached them with a warm smile. Thank you for coming, he said, guiding them to seats that had been reserved in the front row. We're just getting started. Nina felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see Thomas, the postal worker who had recorded the incident, sitting behind her. Good to see you again, he said softly. How are you holding up? Better today, Nia replied with a small smile. Thank you for what you did yesterday. On the other side of town, a very different meeting was taking place in a wood-paneled courtroom. Officer Winters stood before Judge Patel, flanked by his attorney and a representative from the police union. The preliminary hearing had been fast-tracked due to the high-profile nature of the case and the overwhelming evidence. Your Honor, District Attorney Crawford addressed the court. The state is charging the defendant, Richard Winters, with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, assault, official oppression, and filing a false police report. Given the severity of these charges and the defendant's position of authority, we ask that bail be set accordingly. Officer Winters' attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Ms. Reynolds, stepped forward. Your Honor, my client has served this community for 12 years with distinction. He has strong ties to this community and is not a flight risk. We request reasonable bail. Judge Patel looked down at Officer Winters over her reading glasses. Mr. Winters, I've reviewed the evidence in this case, including multiple videos from multiple angles. I rarely see such clear documentation of misconduct. She paused. Bail is set at $150,000. Officer Winter's face drained of color. He turned to his attorney in disbelief. Back at the community meeting, Pastor Lloyd had invited Doris Wilson to speak. The silver-haired woman who had called 911 stood at the microphone, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 42 years, she began. "I've seen good times and bad times. I've seen police officers who protected our community and those who seemed to fear it." She looked directly at Nia. "What I saw yesterday was wrong on every level, but what happened next gave me hope." She went on to describe Lieutenant Chen's immediate response, how she had listened to the witnesses and taken swift action. "That's the kind of policing we need," Doris concluded. "Officers who hold each other accountable, who understand that a badge is not a shield from consequences, but a symbol of responsibility." The room erupted in applause. When it quieted, Pastor Lloyd approached the microphone again. "We have someone else who would like to say a few words. Lieutenant Chen from the police department." A murmur of surprise ran through the crowd as Lieutenant Chen walked to the front of the room. She was not in uniform, but dressed in simple civilian clothes. "I'm here tonight not as a representative of the department," she began, "but as a member of this community. What happened yesterday was a failure that I take personally as someone who trains other officers." She took a deep breath. "I want you to know that charges have been filed against Officer Winters. He will face the full consequences of his actions." She turned to look directly at Nia. "I'd also want to apologize to you. No one should ever be treated the way you were treated, especially not by someone sworn to protect and serve." The room fell silent, absorbing the power of this public acknowledgement. "The department is launching a full review of our training procedures," Lieutenant Chen continued. "And we're establishing a community oversight committee that will have real power to review complaints against officers." She paused. "We can do better. We must do better." As she stepped away from the microphone, someone in the back of the room began to clap slowly. Others joined in until the entire room was filled with applause. Nia's grandmother squeezed her hand. "See," she whispered. "Change happens when good people stand up." 3 months later, the courtroom was packed for the final day of Richard Winter's trial. Nia sat in the front row between her grandmother and Lieutenant Chen, who had become a regular visitor to their home. Behind them sat Thomas, Doris, and many of the other witnesses who had stepped forward that day at the bus stop. The trial had moved surprisingly quickly, largely due to the overwhelming video evidence and the number of witnesses. Officer Winters had maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he was just doing his job and that his actions had been misinterpreted. The jury had deliberated for less than 5 hours. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Patel entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. Nia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Her grandmother reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Patel asked once everyone was seated again. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged teacher, stood. "We have, Your Honor." A hush fell over the courtroom as she read from the paper in her hands. "On the count of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Richard Winters, guilty." Nia closed her eyes, letting out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "On the count of assault, we find the defendant guilty." A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. "On the count of official oppression, we find the defendant guilty." Officer Winters stood stiffly beside his attorney, his face unreadable. "On the count of filing a false police report, we find the defendant guilty." Judge Patel thanked the jury for their service and then turned to Officer Winters. "The defendant will remain in custody until sentencing next week." She banged her gavel and the bailiff led Winters away. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, their cameras and microphones ready. District Attorney Crawford gave a brief statement. "Today's verdict sends a clear message that a badge does not place anyone above the law." Justice was served. Nia and her grandmother tried to slip away quietly, but a reporter spotted them. "Nia, how do you feel about the verdict?" Nia hesitated, then spoke softly. "I'm just glad people believed me." Back home, Mrs. Johnson made Nia's favorite dinner to celebrate. "I'm so proud of you," she told her granddaughter. "You've shown such strength through all of this." Nia pushed her food around her plate. "Do you think things will really change now?" Or will it just go back to the way it was? Her grandmother sat down beside her. Change doesn't happen all at once, but it does happen. Look at what's already different. She was right. In the 3 months since the incident, the police department had implemented several major changes. Every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters with the public. A civilian oversight committee had been established with real power to investigate complaints. And a new training program focused on de-escalation and recognizing bias had become mandatory for all officers. 1 week later, Nia returned to the courthouse for the sentencing. Richard Winters was given 18 months in prison, a sentence almost unheard of for police misconduct cases. As summer turned to fall, Nia started her junior year of high school. The incident had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She had joined the school's social justice club and started thinking about becoming a lawyer someday. Lieutenant Chen, now Captain Chen after her recent promotion, had invited Nia to speak at police training sessions, sharing her experience with new officers. At first, Nia had been terrified, but she found her voice growing stronger each time. Your story helps these officers understand the impact of their actions, Captain Chen told her after one such session. You're making a real difference. On the anniversary of that day at the bus stop, Nia returned to the same bench. She sat down and looked around at the ordinary people passing by, a mother with 2 small children, an older man walking his dog, a group of teenagers laughing together. Thomas, still on his mail route, spotted her and waved. "How's it going?" he called out. "Better," Nia replied with a smile. "Much better." As the bus pulled up right on schedule, Nia gathered her things. The events of that day would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was what she chose to do with the voice she had found, a voice that people were finally ready to hear.